He has degrees in biology and aquatic sciences and management. He has been working with the Colorado Parks and Wildlife for 12 years, and his current role is the senior aquatic biologist for the South Platte River Basin for all of Northwest Colorado. He loves enjoying the outdoors and activities out there with his family. And he's here tonight to talk to us about the Greenback Cutthroat trout recovery. So please welcome Kyle.
All right. Well, this will take me a minute to get used to, but yeah. So thanks for having me tonight. Really excited to be here and be able to talk to you all about cutthroat trout conservation. Thank you. So yeah, John said I had 45 minutes. It's been a while since I gave a 45-minute presentation. So hopefully that's what you all were anticipating, and we'll see how this goes. Let me start a stopwatch just so we can kind of keep track. So yeah, so again, the Northeast Senior Aquatic Biologist, so involved with management of kind of all the public water bodies in the Platte River Basin. So that's anything in the South Platte, the Laramie, or the North Platte River within Colorado. So that's kind of the Northeast region for Colorado Parks and Wildlife. In terms of what we're going to talk about, is it not that arrow? So what? Yeah. You good with that? Okay. So in terms of kind of what we're going to talk about, we're going to start off just with some background information, introduce myself a tiny bit more, and then talk about fishery management in general, kind of at a broader overview level in terms of CPW management. And then it's not really fair to just dive into the story saga of greenback cutthroat trout without kind of that broader landscape picture of cutthroat trout conservation in the state of Colorado as a whole, because it's a very large influencing factor. And then, yeah, talk about cutthroat trout diversity in Colorado. I switched the order of those two, so we're going to then jump into kind of the greenback story specific and what we're doing as CPW in the Northeast region for greenback cutthroat trout conservation, and then dive into what goes into a reclamation project and conservation of cutthroat trout. So in terms of me, yeah, I grew up in Michigan. I don't know if that was in the bio or not, but I grew up in Michigan, born and raised in the northern lower peninsula, grew up hunting and fishing and just had a strong passion for it. I went to school and got my bachelor's and master's degree from the University of Michigan. My master's thesis work was on muskie spawning habitat in Green Bay, Wisconsin, with the Wisconsin DNR, so a far cry from cutthroat trout conservation work, but it got me here nonetheless. Yeah, and then finishing my master's, decided to move out west and worked as a seasonal technician in 2012 for CPW and kind of never looked back since then. I was the area aquatic biologist, which we'll talk a little bit about what that means in a few slides, over in Meeker, which is area 6 for CPW. So managed the White and parts of the Yampa River in Meeker from 2012 to 2015. And then transferred to the Fort Collins position as the area biologist managing the Poudre, North Platte, and Laramie River drainages, and then moved into this senior biologist role last June. So that's kind of quick summary from me, but I like to generally get a little bit of a feel for the audience that I'm speaking to, just to see if there's points kind of throughout to tailor some of the talking to what you all are interested in. I mean, it's pretty well set. We're here to talk about cutthroat trout, but some questions for you. So I think the message went out a little more broadly than this specific cutthroat trout chapter. So is there anybody else from a different chapter, a different TU chapter here? Where are you from? Okay, cool. And then some poll in terms of you all as anglers. I'm assuming most of you are cold water anglers. Would you classify yourself? It's okay. I think it's a safe space to raise your hand. Are there any warm water anglers? Okay, how about just you would consider yourself both? You like, okay. So maybe were there any specific warm water anglers in the group, or are you in the both? Okay. Good idea to probably keep your hand down. Um, okay, the next couple things. If I told you you had to go fishing tomorrow, it was non-negotiable, you had to go fishing, I want to know, are you going to a lake? Are you fishing flat water or are you fishing flowing water? Raise your hand for flat water. Okay, raise your hand for flowing water. How many of you didn't make a decision? Okay, next question. This is helpful for me, so bear with me. So tomorrow, same thing, you're fishing. And are you fishing for quantity of fish? So you want to go and have a lot of action and be assured that you're going to catch 1 or 20 fish. Or, and that's a broad range, I realize that, or are you going for quality and a large fish, whatever that means to you, whatever the species is? Who's going quantity? How about quality? You're the North Delaney addicts that are there for one fish in 2 days. And you still had a good time even if you don't catch that one. Okay, the next one. Favorite locations. I only like 5. Just shout them out. If you were going fishing tomorrow, where are you going? What are kind of the top destinations? Top secret. That's the real answer. I also like Park County. I'm going to get kicked off stage. We'll move on to the next question. Okay, how about species? Cutthroat. Okay. What was it? Whatever bites. That's a fair. Rainbows. No tiger trout, folks. Tigers, golden trout. Sit in pike. Okay. You might also get run out of the group. Who knows? Okay. Well, thank you for bearing with me through that. So yeah, let's talk we'll start broad here. Fishery management in Colorado. So in general, I would say CPW, we're managing aquatic resources, fisheries towards 2 primary goals. They're not exclusive, but those 2 are recreation and opportunity and recovery and conservation. So something like cutthroat trout, that can certainly check both of those boxes, right? We're actively working towards conservation, and they're also a recreation species for us as well. There's a lot of challenges when it comes to fishery management. I don't think, hopefully none of you are going to learn this lessons for the first time today, but fish do need water. So if you're fishing and you're not in water, good luck. But in terms of looking at the state of Colorado and water use, water development, there's a lot of water development projects. There's a lot of demand for water in a variety of arenas, and it's a pretty hot commodity. So that is certainly a challenge, balancing angler preferences just within this small group of Trout Unlimited folks. There's differences in opinion. Some want to catch quantity, some want to catch quality, some are fishing South Park, some are maybe fishing North Park, and the variety of species you all named too. I'm not going to really talk about the water code categorization bullet point there, but in terms of management in Colorado, again, I'm the Northeast Senior Aquatic Biologist, so that's kind of this shade of color. Again, we break the state into 4 regions. You can go to the next slide. And then it's further broken down from regions into areas. So each area within CPW, within the state of Colorado, as CPW defines them, which there's 18 of, there's an area aquatic biologist associated with that area. We have 2 other aquatic biologists in the room. I told them this morning I wasn't going to make them speak, but I'm going to make them raise their hands. So Kira and Aubrey are here tonight. So Kira is, yeah. So Kira is the management biologist for Area 1, which is South Park, this shade of color here. If you can make that out. And then Aubrey's managing Area 5, which is that area. So Kira covers the Upper South Platte, Bear Creek, Clear Creek, and the South Platte down to Cheeseman. Aubrey takes over management from Cheeseman downstream through Denver. I couldn't tell him. There's probably a confluence somewhere. Um, but yeah, so that's kind of the general breakdown of how CPW handles fishery management. So each of these names on here in different shades of color is an area aquatic biologist. There's also within each region a native aquatic species biologist that's focused on native aquatic species management and conservation. Yeah, yep. The question was about geographic boundaries with area biologists. Those did change a little bit relatively recently within the last year. We swapped those out a little bit. So historically, the Area 5 biologist, who was Paul Winkle, if that name rings a bell for anybody, was managing from Waterton Canyon, kind of Waterton Canyon downstream through Chatfield, the South Platte, and he also covered Bear Creek and Clear Creek. And we have switched that to where the more align with CPW area distinctions, those boundary distinctions. So Kira's covering Bear Creek, Clear Creek down to the CPW boundary, which is kind of the foothills for lack of getting into specifics. And then Aubrey's now taking over South Platte management downstream of Cheeseman. So yeah, that is a shift. So yeah, let's go ahead to the next slide. So, I give talks occasionally, and it might be Trout Unlimited one night down here. It might be Rocky Mountain Flycasters up north a different month, or it might be, the Bass Masters Club or the Walleye Association. And I just kind of we'll take a moment and just kind of point out some of like the management just within Area 1 and Area 4 out of Fort Collins. Any area is relatively similar, but out of Fort Collins, as the area biologist, you're managing anything from warm water in Greeley, Horsetooth Reservoir, warm water fisheries all the way up to high elevation lakes at 12,000 feet and everything in between, and then gold medal water in North Park and everything. So it's a pretty diverse management activities that these biologists are doing. So I think sometimes the question is like, well, just do more greenback cutthroat trout work. It's easy, right? Well, if we do that, then somebody else is going to ask what the heck's going on at Spinney, and somebody else is going to ask what's going on at the Dream Stream. And if you solely focus on one of those activities, there's only so much time in the day. And I can tell you, every biologist around the state is working their tail off, and they're out there collecting data and doing a really good job of it. But it always, at the end of the day, I think for everybody, comes down to prioritization. And again, trying to strike that balance in terms of management. So you're not off the hook yet. I have a few more questions, but it's too small a font and hard to read. Area 1, so Kira's management area, which did change, but this red line right here, how many, just shout out a number, unique water bodies Kira manages? 100? 41? Higher? Both. 100. God, we're going to be here all night, I'll tell you. 587 unique water bodies. So that's some of those I will say, we're not actively managing, right? Not every 2 foot wide stream with 6-inch brook trout in it. We're necessarily out there we're not out there sampling every year or anything like that. So don't take it like that, but a lot of water bodies. How about a guess on how many river miles that encompasses? Yeah, 2,232. How about lake surface acres? So this is all lakes. Antero, Spinney, every backcountry alpine lake that you like to fish. 1,200, higher. 8,000, you're getting close. 9,103 surface acres. How many fish do you think Kira stocked in Area 1 in 2023? This is, so in terms of her management area, goes down to like 1 inch cutthroat trout dropped out of an airplane into X Alpine Lake, all the way up to 10-inch catchable rainbow trout in Spinney and 8-inch tiger muskie in Antero. And this number is drastically different depending on the biologist. It'd be ridiculously higher if we asked about Aubrey's management that includes stocking 3.5 million walleye fry in Cherry Creek or Chatfield. But in terms of South Park, Area 1, who would like to throw out a number? 18,000? Getting closer. We do have 45 minutes, so we could just let you guess. 1.8 million fish stocked. So again, that goes down to 1-inch fish, in an alpine lake that includes every subcatchable rainbow trout, every 10-inch rainbow trout and terreal and spinney and you name it. But lots of fish going out, lots of things to monitor and try to get a handle on and keep tabs on in terms of management. Yeah, she's got 3 current greenback cutthroat trout waters. We're working on, I don't even probably, or with the greenback, 1.8 million. We're really good at what we do, so probably 1.799. Oh, I mean, it depends on the location. Fish dropped out of an airplane, if they meet all the criteria, which includes hitting the lake, which our pilots are really good, so we generally do that. A lot of those, if you're talking 10-inch trout in 11 mile with a bunch of pike, probably fewer. But yeah, and then you can click next slide. And there's a few more bullets on there, but so you go back one. So yeah, kind of that's just looking at like management in general in terms of what these biologists are doing out on the ground. And again, that's not to, it's just really to drive home the point of like they're all working their asses off out there, and they're spread across a whole bunch of species, a whole bunch of conservation efforts, boreal toads, greenbacks, small-bodied native fish, depending on the biologist. So lots going on. I think we can go to the next slide. I think you're off the hook for a little while. This was a slide of pictures I just had compiled from Area Aquatic Biologist Day, just kind of showing some of the diversity. Yeah, some of the diversity and species in a given year. Again, Kira's not managing walleye, but she's down at Walleye Spawn helping out because it's an important Northeast project. Don't ask me where those questions are from. I already learned the lesson. I'm not telling you. This one was to drive home the point of, again, they're working their tails off and we push it too far many years. That wasn't Winkle's truck. His was actually upside down. What was that? A week before his retirement. If you know Paul, you should send him a picture of that and be like, is that you? But it wasn't. All right, next slide. So now I think we're to the point we can talk about cutthroat trout. And really, to start the cutthroat trout topic and discussion, you really have to start with Dr. Bob Banke, who is a professor at CSU. I think we can go next slide. So Dr. Trout, as he was called, so he was a biologist through the Fish and Wildlife Service Co-op unit and then a professor at CSU, and really laid the foundational work in terms of cutthroat trout taxonomy, really of the West, and in particular in Colorado. So let's go next slide. And this is kind of one of the maps that Dr. Banke laid out. You can really see these 4 major kind of groups of cutthroat trout: the Lahontan, Yellowstone, West Slope, and coastal. If we go to the next slide, you're going to see kind of how he broke those out on a phylogenetic tree. And the belief was that a lot of this separation had happened within the last million years. And all of his work was based on meuristics, so meuristic being like a quantifiable character trait, so a countable trait. So you were looking at something like number of scales in a given area of the fish, or maybe particular spotting patterns and concentration of spotting patterns. So really phenotypic outward expression of genes, characteristics is what this breakdown was based upon. So who thinks they can guess what we would call that? heard a few different answers. That came out of a blue lineage, Colorado River, Cutthroat Trout stream. This was a Rio Grande, and that's a Greenback. So let's go next slide. So kind of over the years, as DNA became kind of entered the world in terms of being a tool, in a lot of really fast development in terms of novel techniques in taxonomy and phylogeny and how people were classifying different organisms. This also happened with cutthroat trout. And if we go to the next slide, so a lot of the DNA work was really revolutionizing things and leading us to ask a lot of questions about cutthroat trout conservation and what we thought we knew about it. In particular, instead of cutthroat trout splitting away from rainbow trout, we believe to have happened around 1 million years ago. This fossil record suggested it was more along the lines of 10 to 11 million years ago. All right, let's go next slide. So I don't want to, we could be here for a long time talking, and I wouldn't be the person to talk to it, kind of about the current status of the debate, even within the fisheries community in terms of cutthroat trout taxonomy. But you can see kind of a different phylogenetic tree here in the breakdown based on some genetic work. And when you get into geneticists, you could probably say the same thing about, I think, fish biologists in general, but there's a wide range in opinions and differing opinions, even with genetics in what you consider a lineage, a subspecies, a totally new species. And there's definitely separate groups of lumpers and splitters, where you'd end up with a whole bunch of different species, and other people that say, you know, this genetic difference, we should just consider all of these rainbow trout. I don't think anybody says that, but there's definitely a wide variety in terms of lumpers and splitters when it comes to the DNA work. So we're going to fast forward, next slide. So I guess we're not yet, sorry. So this is kind of distribution of cutthroat trout as we knew it pre-2012, again, a lot of which was based on Dr. Banky's work. So you can, again, kind of see the breakdown in Colorado of really those 4 major groups of Colorado River, Colorado River, cutthroat trout, west slope fish, greenbacks native to the South Platte, in Arkansas, Rio Grandes, and then extinct yellowfins from Twin Lake. Okay, next slide. So then raise your hand. Has anybody heard of this study of Metcalf? Okay, so we can spend some time here. So that study came out of the University of Colorado in 2007 by Metcalf et al. And her work was looking at genetic samples from a variety of cutthroat trout that were sampled around the state. And if you remember that previous slide, you don't have to go back to it, but you would assume pretty logical breakdown in color, if color is representing genetic diversity, in terms of you'd have west slope fish and east slope fish. And what we ended up finding was that continental divide really had little to do with the genetics, generally speaking, that we found, whether you were on the east slope, the west slope, in the northwest, the southwest. It was really a mix. And we had these blue lineage, Colorado River cutthroat trout fish down here, over here, up there. And then you can further break it down and look at unique haplotypes. So even within Colorado River, White River, Yampa River genetics, there's unique haplotypes where fish have been in a distinct area for a really long time, and they look different genetically over here than they do 3 drainages over in the White River, which we're interested in conserving kind of all of the above. So next slide. So this paper led to a lot of questions, a lot of press, national press coverage, and yeah, a lot of bad publicity, if you will. You know, and suddenly these great conservation efforts and success stories of greenback cutthroat trout conservation through the 80s and 90s, you know, work that our predecessors were doing was getting called into question. The work of Dr. Banky, it called into question. Next slide. So there are a bunch of articles. What does the next slide look like? Yeah, there it is. So this is kind of one of the favorite ones. So conservationists save wrong fish. A picture in the caption, a picture of fried fish, and the caption reads, "A greenback cutthroat trout yesterday." And then, you know, all of kind of, I guess, the findings of the Metcalf study really for this particular writer got boiled down to schoolboy error on behalf of fish biologists like myself. So this, as you can imagine, really raised a lot of questions that we didn't have answers to at the time. So let's go next slide. So a follow-up study by Metcalf et al., again out of Colorado, University of Colorado in 2012. And this really sought to answer a lot of those questions that came out of their findings in 2007. And so how did we end up here with this genetic diversity that we see across the landscape that really doesn't make sense if you're thinking about how a fish would migrate on its own? So they really dove in. There's a deep dive into historical stocking records and a deep dive into museum specimens. So way back, early or mid to late 1800s, kind of what it looked like before white settlers got here. So let's go next slide. Anybody tell me where that's from? Flat Tops. Anybody know that lake? Nope. Trappers Lake. So headwaters of the North Fork of the White River. Got to spend a lot of time up there as a management biologist in Meeker. Great spot, and is kind of a focal point to this cutthroat trout story. So let's go next slide. So as we dove into historic stocking records, what we found is, lo and behold, we've been moving fish around for a really long time. And it explains some of the story, not all of the story, but again, if you're kind of looking at this figure, you're looking at, the font of that line, if you will, the weight of that line associated with different magnitudes of fish that left. Let's go next slide. So go back one, actually. So Trappers Lake, again, you're at the headwaters of the North Fork of the White River. We ended up spawning a lot of fish in the relatively early 1900s out of Trappers Lake. And they were carried by horseback over the flat tops down in around the Glenwood area, loaded on a train, and then dispersed out from there pretty readily. So let's go next slide. Yet that doesn't really explain the entire story to the genetic picture we saw out on the landscape. So you might ask yourself, like, what is the deal with the greenfish? Next slide. Next slide. So what about the green ones? So when we sampled a lot of populations around the state, this being the continental divide, you could see a lot of those green lineages were indeed on the west slope. Not all of the genetics we found. And let's go next slide. And what we found was not too dissimilar from Trappers Lake. There was a lake up on the Grand Mesa that was also producing a lot of cutthroat trout, slightly different than the cutthroat trout in Trappers Lake. But these green lineage fish, we'll call them, were being distributed around the state as well. Next slide. Similar thing. So, in this, they back then called them black spotted trout. Makes sense. Cutthroat trout being black spotted. So this is saying trout eggs to the number of 7 million in that one season have been developed here to the eyed stage with only a normal loss, and are getting distributed around the state. They're transported in these old jugs like that, and again carried out on horseback. Pretty easy to disseminate around the state from there. All right, next slide. So this is again similar figure with green lineage cutthroat trout. And you can see again, a lot of species pretty well distributed, or a lot of individuals very well distributed around the state in those early 1900s. I had a couple notes wanted to share. Let's go next slide. And it was really just kind of to speak to the fact that, natural resources in the state of Colorado have been obviously very important since people got here, whether all the way back to indigenous people, all the way back to first white settlers coming from the east. And these expeditions from these 4 individuals in particular were pretty paramount in these in the DNA museum specimens that we're going to talk about. That was kind of the second part of the Metcalf 2012 study. And just to kind of highlight that, I had written down a few dates. So for example, you have these dates on here, but in 1861, in Colorado, the first wildlife law was passed. It was unlawful to take trout by seine, net, basket, or trap. In 1876, the first fish commissioner was appointed. 1881, the first hatchery was built in Colorado. 1897 saw the founding of the Department of Forestry, Game and Fish. So even before 1900, the state of Colorado, recognized the importance of managing wildlife with the creation of what's now CPW. In 1909, non-resident fishing licenses were implemented. Before 1913, which is when resident fishing licenses were implemented. So even way back in the early 1900s, you can imagine folks complaining about people, non-residents, in their fishing spot. So having come from Michigan, I'm sorry. So maybe some things have changed and some things maybe haven't. So let's go to the next slide. So coming out of that 2012 Metcalf paper, and really based on that stocking history that we just talked about and these DNA specimens. So these are specimens housed from those expeditions of those four early expeditioners. And they're housed like in the Smithsonian and museums back east. And they were able to extract DNA out of those and then look at the distribution of where those records came from and what their DNA makeup consisted of. And what we saw was a lot different than what Banky had prescribed. We had 6 distinct lineages corresponding with every major river basin except the North Platte. And at the time of this paper in 2012, 2 were thought to be extinct: the Rio Grandes, the San Juans and the yellowfin. And you can kind of see the distribution here. There's obviously some mixing of colors. And let's go next slide. So this is kind of that shift. This is what we thought pre-2012. Fast forward through those 2 Metcalf papers, and this is kind of our understanding currently of cutthroat trout distribution, taxonomy in the state of Colorado. Go ahead. So slightly different phylogenetic tree in terms of that big 4 breakdown of Western cutthroat trout. You still have those 4: West Slope, Lahontan, coastals, and Yellowstone is a broad group. But in that group, you can see a lot of those Colorado lineages breaking out a little differently based on genetics. So yeah, the end of that story in terms and kind of the beginning of the Greenback story is that coming out of that 2012 paper, we had 1 single population of true greenbacks found in Bear Creek in the Arkansas River Basin. And the quick story on that, I don't remember the guy's name. A gentleman kind of homesteaded this area up at the headwaters of Bear Creek, dug out a few ponds, and built some cabins to attract tourists that were headed on their way up to Long's Peak and wanted fish for his guests to fish for. The closest fish were over the divide in the South Platte headwaters. And so the current belief, pretty sure this is what happened, he went over or got fish from probably not a vendor back then, but got fish from the South Platte, moved them over into the Arkansas and the headwaters of Bear Creek. And then they persisted there ever since and are protected by a natural barrier. Next slide. So where are we at with the status of Colorado's cutthroat trout lineages? You can kind of see the lineage on the left, number of populations to date on the right. Greenbacks, the purple color there, again, native to the South Platte. We've got 9. They're a federally threatened species. You compare that to, say, blue lineage cutthroat trout. These are, descendants of, this is white Yampa River Trappers Lake fish. We've got about 300 populations on the landscape. So, different statuses for sure in terms of cutthroat trout conservation. Let's go next slide. So, threats to cutthroat trout conservation. How have we gotten here? The obvious answer is we've moved a lot of fish in a lot of different places. That was just cutthroat trout, let alone what we've done with rainbows, brook trout, brown trout, all the above. Who throw out another threat to cutthroat trout conservation? Fire, good. People, warm water, lack of water, climate change. I would say all correct answers. Go ahead and populate that one. Mining, yeah, a lot of those I would lump under an umbrella of habitat degradation. Um, Disease, so whirling disease, obviously a big player. Non-native fish, we've talked about introgression of cutthroat trout with other cutthroat trout. Rainbow trout can also cross and introgress and hybridize, and therefore are an issue for cutthroat trout conservation. Add in competition with brook and brown trout. Lots of things going on. This is a picture out of the Poudre Basin, of a stream that we have greenback cutthroat trout in, but it just completely got nuked in 2020 by the Cameron Peak wildfire. So no shortage of threats. Go ahead to the next slide. Yes, sir. What was the question? It's still going on in Colorado. It's still present, and still a big factor in trout management, both rainbows and cutthroat trout. So yes, that's definitely a criteria. We're evaluating presence or absence of whirling disease, and something we take into consideration when looking at new conservation populations. So let's dive into greenbacks here. Go ahead, next slide. So in terms of kind of where we are with greenbacks specifically, these are kind of the topics we'll briefly touch on. Go ahead. So this is kind of recovery progress update, if you will. These are the populations that are either currently they exist on the landscape with fish, or they are ones we are actively working on and in various stages of kind of that project timeline. For example, we believe Rock and Black Canyon Creeks and Kira's management area that we have eradicated all non-native fish from those. It's currently still testing slightly positive for whirling disease. So we can't stock greenbacks in there until we've eradicated whirling disease, because whirling disease will certainly take its toll on greenbacks if we put them in there. But we believe we've removed all of the non-native trout that were present in those two creeks. We are actively working on, say, like the Jenny Creek complex, and you can kind of see on the right what that means for like surface acres and miles of conservation. Go ahead, slide. Where do those water bodies on that table fall in the landscape of the South Platte? That's what this is showing. So green dots, these three, those four, are completed projects with fish on the landscape, and then yellow dots are projects in progress. Let's go next slide. So I just wanted to briefly touch on some of these individual projects that we've been working on. Kind of some of the first work outside of Zimmerman, which I think we'll talk about next, were reclamations in Dry and Herman Gulch. So Dry and Herman Gulch at the headwaters of Clear Creek. The Eisenhower Tunnel is right there. So Dry and Herman Gulch, we did reclamations there in 2014 and 15, I think it was. Go ahead, next slide. Had successful reclamations in back-to-back years in those drainages, and then proceeded to stock fish from 2016 to 2019. That's kind of the standard operating protocol, if you will. Reclaim stream, remove fish. You've got a barrier to keep new fish from getting into that space, and then restock fish. We generally go with 3-year classes of fish, and the hope is that, after 3 years, those age 0 fish you stocked are turning into 3-year-olds, and then that year or the next year, those females will be reproductively active, and you should be able to then monitor for natural reproduction. And if you're finding little fish at that point, you've documented natural reproduction. So go ahead to the next slide. So that's what all this follow-up population estimate work is showing. This is a number of sampling stations that we have in Herman Gulch to monitor the success of the cutthroat trout conservation work that we did in there. This has been ongoing since we put fish in there. And 2 years ago, we documented the first natural reproduction in Herman Gulch, and the first natural reproduction of greenback cutthroat trout in their native range for a really long time. So go ahead to the next slide. Your clapping like made me realize that I meant to and should have prefaced all of this with like have really truly been like instrumental in like 1% of this work. So it's this culmination of work by a lot of folks, a lot of entities, Trout Unlimited, probably your chapter included, for sure, and other chapters around the Front Range. So thank you all for your time, effort, dollars, conservation. It really does make a difference, and this truly is. You know, that's one, I guess, raise your hand. Wow. Yeah. Well, thank you. No, I mean, how many people were there on those days? 50? So, yeah, getting fish into those drainages. Yeah. So, thank you all. I mean, truly, you know, whether you're talking external agency partners, the Forest Service, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, um, you know, can't do it without all of them. And all of these projects are, you know, have been contributed by all of those partners along with many of you as well, and other angling groups too. So yeah, this is just kind of looking at fish population estimates in Herman Gulch through time. You know, I wouldn't be alarmed at kind of these decreasing trends through time. Like at this station, this is looking at like 2017, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22. I think we'd overstocked probably a little bit, overshot maybe carrying capacity, if you will, with some of our stocking efforts in some of those sections of Herman Gulch. And some of these numbers where we've seen population estimates leveling out are more in line with historic blue lineage cutthroat trout population estimate numbers of the fish that were there before the reclamation. Okay, next slide. So here you go. Fish management 101, length frequency distribution. So we're looking at length in millimeters, if that's not confusing for you. 6 inches is 150. So here we're looking at number of fish collected in a given size bin. And what I'm going to tell you is you can easily see year classes of fish. So again, in 2022, we documented the first natural reproduction with 40 millimeter fish. I mean, you're talking like big, age 0 fish growing into an age 1 fish, growing into an age 2 fish, 3 fish, so forth. And again, remember, this is 6 inches. So we're looking at a 0, 1, 2-year-old fish in Herman Gulch is 5 inches long. So pretty slow growth rates, pretty cold water where those fish are. Go ahead to the next slide. That is a good question. I mean, it's of course going to range, but don't quote me on it, but 6, I mean, I think would be a fair assessment. It's going to depend on the location, how cold it is, how much food there is, all of those things. But, you know, from what we see in other populations, other trout, and some of our tagging data in Herman Gulch, I'd say around that 5, 6. So, West Fork of Clear Creek, this was fishless above the mine. We introduced greenback cutthroat trout into there. We ceased stocking last year. So go ahead to next slide. So we stocked for 3 years. Sampling results from 2023 with 2-year classes of fish in at the time. We saw both of those year classes of fish in Herman Gulch, or in West Fork of Clear Creek, sorry. So they're persisting in there. The next question is, do they reproduce on their own? And therefore, are they a naturally reproduced conservation counting kind of population? Let's go next slide. So Zimmerman Lake, this was reclaimed in 2014. It sits at the headwaters of the Poudre River, right off of Cameron Pass. If you know where Joe Wright Reservoir is, look south up the hill, and Zimmerman sits right above that. So we did a reclamation here to remove cutthroat trout and stocked it with greenbacks. Go ahead to the next slide. The inlet to Zimmerman is too cold to support natural reproduction, so we stock it every year. It was super successful in the beginning with really good survival of those stocked fish, all called recruitment, not natural reproduction, but recruitment of stocked fish from 1 year to the next. And then we went back to take a wild spawn there. Go ahead to the next slide. And the wild spawn operation was as successful as we had hoped it would be in the initial years. And then it's been dropping off ever since then. We don't know why. I think, again, it's a combination of a lot of factors. We've looked at escapement. There's definitely avian predation up there. It's open to fishing, but not harvest. Lots of dissolved oxygen seems like it's coming out to likely be a potential limiting factor, especially depending on the year. We snowshoed up there and skied up there last April, and there was at the end of April still 36 inches of ice on Zimmerman. And DO levels were at like 2, which is not good. Next slide. So again, we allow, they're federally threatened. We can still have public angling opportunity associated with greenback cutthroat trout. We've been running a passive creel survey at Zimmerman. And this is just kind of reported catch. And you can see the previous slides showing that decrease in numbers of adults spawned. Anglers saw that decrease in reported catch rates kind of plummeting around the same time period. And with that, I think disgruntled anglers that didn't want to fill out the card anymore. I don't blame you. Next slide. So that leads us to fish production challenges. So another thing to know about greenback cutthroat trout, all of our source genetics are coming out of, again, one single population. Where was it? Bear Creek. What drainage? Arkansas. So we believe, that population was in a pretty isolated, limited number of river miles and severely genetically bottlenecked as a result. And that has led to problems in production. So really poor survival from fish spawned at a hatchery. So a lot of these adults are housed at the Leadville National Fish Hatchery. When they spawn fish, we're averaging 5% survival. So 95% of the eggs they spawn and fertilize end up dying and don't turn into real fish. We had far better survival, but not great, with eggs produced from Zimmerman coming out to about 25% survival, so 75% pickoff. So we're on the hunt for new brood lakes because of some of these larger populations that meta populations we're working towards and striving for and doing reclamations for that are going to account for 9 miles of stream or 17 miles of stream in total. We're seeing a gap here. We have a limiting factor of fish production, and we're worried that in 5-6 years, under the current scenario, we're not going to be able to hit target numbers to actually get fish back into those places that we're planning on stocking. So we're actively looking for new brood lakes. We have 2 projects in the Northeast this year that are working towards filling that gap and creating new brood lakes in the Northeast region. If generally speaking, yes, that's certainly the, I don't know if I should even say preferred approach. That's usually the approach. With something like this, there's other options on the table that we are exploring of, like, you could put greenbacks on top of brown trout, on top of even other cutthroat trout, as long as you say tag all of the greenbacks. And then the only thing you're going to spawn are greenbacks. The last thing we want to do is reinvent the trapper's scenario and end up spawning, hybridized fish at an operation that we think are greenback, and then we send them out and just further complicate the story. But yeah, so fish production is a challenge that we're working towards to overcome, and really driven by that genetic bottleneck of greenbacks, unfortunately. Next slide. I don't think we need to dive into that. I think I've talked too much to go into that. Go next slide. So yeah, this kind of brings us to 2024 plans. 47 minutes. Nobody's leaving yet, but we'll I can make a lot more slides. So Slater Lake is one that we are actively looking at. Kira's probably been up there in the last 7 days, I would imagine, maybe twice. So this sits towards the headwaters of the Fall Creek drainage, above Chin's Reservoir, if anybody knows where that is. So this is one that we have been stocking aerially with, we'll call them recreation grade lineage genetics, cutthroat trout, which are generally what we're dropping out of airplanes for these alpine lakes, are mostly blue lineage, Colorado River cutthroat genetics. Um, so if you didn't know that, if you're fishing in Alpine Lake and catching beautiful cutthroat trout, I'd say there's a 95+% chance that that fish was dropped out of an airplane sometime in the last 8 years. Um, so Slater Lake has been on that aerial stocking schedule. With this one in particular, though, we've got the local district wildlife manager brought it to our attention because he was seeing natural reproduction in the lake. So that's super encouraging. It's not really big. How many acres is it? I told you we're gonna have to talk. I think like 5 or so. Um, so this is one, again, Kira's been up there a lot, along with the native aquatic species biologist, doing a lot of reconnaissance to make sure this checks all those boxes in terms of habitat criteria that we're looking for. Fish can't get into it from below. We just are doing disease testing, just did disease testing, to kind of check that box and make sure we know what we're getting into with potential diseases. Hopefully that's clean bill of health. Um, it has for a long time supported the fish that we have been stocking in there. So it checks that box in terms of you would anticipate then that greenbacks could survive in there as well. There are cutthroat trout in there that we don't want. So this we have tentatively planned for a September 2024 reclamation project. Um, next slide. Jenny Lake. This is in the kind of Big Thompson, St. Vrain country. Jenny Creek Complex has 2 lakes, one of which is Jenny Lake. This is another one that we are anticipating reclaiming in 2024. It sits at a little bit too high of an elevation, and access doesn't really work out with when we can get in there to do a wild spawn operation for this one to turn into a brood lake. But it's one of 2 lakes in the drainage, along with like 7 miles of stream, so we're still going after it in terms of conservation value overall. Probably not going to turn into a brood lake. I don't know if that made sense, but we stock these fish out as, like 1-inch fish in September. They need so many temperature units from when they get to the hatchery as an egg to turn into an actual fish that has any chance of survival when it goes into a wild stream or lake. And if those eggs come in too late, say at 11,500 feet, these fish don't spawn until the end of July. If we brought those eggs into the hatchery at the end of July, they don't have enough time to accrue enough temperature units to turn into an actual swimming fish that would have any chance of survival when we need them to go out in September. And you can't really stock much later than September. Next slide. So this, I don't really think we need to dive into. There's a number of slides that kind of talk about reclamation projects and what goes into that. But again, you could easily sit here and just say, well, do more reclamation projects. Seems easy. We're at 9 populations, just do 9 of them next year. And we'll be at 18 and we'll double it. There's a lot that goes into just picking suitable habitat to consider bringing greenbacks into, some of which are laid out here. So there's these habitat biological requirements that it's got to meet, right? So like temperature, for example, we've documented natural reproduction in Herman Gulch. We haven't documented natural reproduction in the drainage next door in Dry Gulch. Dry Gulch is, believe it or not, quite a bit colder than Herman Gulch. They both sit in the same orientation, but Herman Gulch has a little lake towards the top that fish haven't been able to get into, but the solar radiation warms up the water enough that water coming out of Herman Lake, which again, lake is kind of a loose term, but comes out of Herman Lake, warms Herman Gulch proper enough. The temperature is suitable to support natural reproduction in most years. You go over to Dry Gulch, no lake, straight snow melt, pretty high elevation. We have a lot of temperature data, and we don't, in that temperature data suggests that they're, like 1 out of every 3 years, that the temperature is suitable that we would expect reproduction. That former population of Colorado River cutthroat trout genetics that were in there had been there for decades and had been getting by just fine. But there were certainly missing year classes. So not unexpected in Dry Gulch that we haven't documented natural reproduction. Something to consider in terms of temperature. Lost Lake is an option. It's probably going to get stocked soon, like in Red Feather. Yeah, so we're working on that one too. Um, so that's again a pretty small lake, 6-ish surface acres near Red Feather, in the Poudre Basin, and I'd say not an ideal candidate for brood waters. I wouldn't say we're desperate, but we're close to desperate for brood waters. So it was a fishless lake. We, CPW, had historically stocked it with catchable rainbow trout as a recreational fishery up until the 90s. We haven't stocked it since like 1997, so it's fishless. It's relatively shallow, prone to winter kill. So it hasn't had fish in a really long time. So we're looking at and are planning on putting greenback cutthroat trout into Lost Lake as well. Again, it's not going to support 2,000 greenbacks, but it can hopefully kind of serve to fill that gap that we're experiencing with Zimmerman declining and a need for production increases. And there are some other projects like, has anybody heard of the Poudre Headwater Project? So that's a large greenback cutthroat trout conservation effort that will include Long Draw Reservoir, which is a really sizable few hundred acre surface acre lake at the headwaters of the Poudre River. And we fully anticipate once that comes online, that will serve as a pretty solid brood lake. All right. Next slide. Again, this is where it kind of go back to the last one. I think I'm going to stop there. So all the other slides kind of go into detailing like what is a barrier? What is other things related to this? Why do we use rotenone? Because it doesn't bioaccumulate, because it easily degrades in the system. So it's kind of more in the weeds, in depth of how and kind of how we do reclamation projects, which I think we've covered the most important stuff. So yeah. Good question. Generally, I would say I think they can support more individuals and it's easier to catch them. So, if you think about, we were to compare the average, so if you remember back, Herman Gulch length frequency, a 3-year-old fish in Herman Gulch, so just coming into reproductively mature, is 5 to 6 inches. So pretty limited number of eggs. Pretty difficult to collect those fish. You'd have to electrofish large sections of stream to come up with, there's 500 fish in that population, of which some percentage aren't reproductively mature, some percentage are male versus female. So a lot of effort to go into collecting relatively few females that are also going to be fairly small at the end of the day with like a Herman Gulch. If we had a really productive stream, that had 20-inch cutthroat in it, then I think we would consider that option. But when you counter Herman Gulch to like Zimmerman, a 4 or 5-year-old greenback, female greenback in there is 12, 13, 14, 15, 16 inches and producing a couple thousand eggs per female. So I think that's a lot of it. Yeah. Yeah, trap nets. So they're set perpendicular to shore. Fish swim in there and kind of get lost in it's a terrible description of a trap net. It's kind of hard to explain. They get lost in a lot of void, empty space in the net. We can come back and collect them. They do congregate. I mean, in a lake, they're actively looking for spawning habitat. If there's an inlet, they're gonna congregate where they're trying to spawn, and generally easier. There's fewer places where they congregate in a small lake compared to a stream where every riffle run or every run might be good spawning habitat. Good question. Yeah, the question was genetic swamping and potential brood lakes. We've considered that in some streams and haven't gone down that road yet. It'd be a long discussion when you start talking about genetic bottlenecks and the need for genetic rescue with greenbacks. I don't think we haven't crossed that bridge yet for sure. I just don't think we have enough populations on the landscape to how bad that genetic bottleneck in the wild actually is. I mean, it's a real thing for sure. But in terms of genetic swamping in a brood lake, We are for sure with brood waters just going down the road of pure purple greenbacks from Bear Creek, because that's what we want in terms of eggs going out the door to all these other waters in that table that we're stocking. You tell them that? Good questions. Um, yeah, so I would say if the first question in there, I've certainly seen the same thing. I don't think we're doing ourselves as like recovery team, and let's say that's everybody, Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, us, you, anglers. I don't think we're helping our cause by having messaging out there that you can catch a greenback in Rocky Mountain National Park when they're not greenbacks. So if you look at the genetics of those fish in Rocky Mountain National Park, park was very active through, it's probably like the 90s in terms of reclaiming lakes, streams, and putting cutthroat trout back in them. That was under that understanding of the meristic understanding of what cutthroat were. And I forgot to mention, a lot of that work, when you go back, rewind to the slides of like Banky's work, and kind of these taxonomy driven by nearest neighbor concepts. So like if you're in this basin, then like if you're in the Scooter Basin, then those are all greenbacks is what we thought. And then if you reclaim a stream right here, what makes the most sense with that understanding of what to stock there? Well, probably the one that's right over the hill. It's the nearest neighbor. So that was the nearest neighbor concept. So when all the conservation work was done, even in Rocky Mountain National Park in the 90s, it was done under that nearest neighbor concept. But by 19, pick a year, 87, that's you're 60, 70 years removed from millions of fish leaving Trappers Lake and going all over the state. So we were moving a blue lineage Colorado River cutthroat trout here and putting it over there, and something with some green lineage from that lake and putting it over here. Yeah, so those are not true greenbacks. The only places to catch pure greenback cutthroat trout, Bear Creek greenbacks, purple lineage fish, if you're going on colors. It's all super confusing, really easy to understand. Um, Pure greenback, though, Herman Gulch, Dry Gulch, West Fork of Clear Creek, Zimmerman, Square Tops now has them. Lost Lake's going to have them. East Fork of Roaring Creek. I think that's it. Yeah, I mean, if you even went back to that, the pictures of like those three cutthroat trout, one's a Rio Grande, one's a Colorado River genetic, one's a Bear Creek or a greenback. They do look, if you handle enough of them, they look slightly different. But yeah, I mean, if you gave me 50 cutthroat trout around the state of Colorado, I shouldn't discredit myself. If I got 42 of them right, I'd feel good. I don't know what the number would be, but I can discredit myself now at the end of the talk. Yeah, so the question's aerial stocking, what percentage of fish survive the fall? I couldn't tell you an exact number, but it's pretty high. I mean, if you go and sample, like we go and sample a backcountry lake with a gill net, and you have to fish while you're there, it's part of the job. Bummer. Um, we will generally find all year classes represented. We stock them every other year, so there's usually, I mean, they don't grow that fast, but there's usually a gap in that length frequency histogram. And as long as, again, the pilots hit the water and then they have to be below, I think it's 200 feet in elevation off the deck, and then also below X miles per hour in terms of how fast that aircraft is flying. Because if they're higher than that, or if they're going faster than that, the fish actually dry out before they hit the water. So they're loaded in the airplane. I probably have a it wouldn't be in this presentation. So we have 4 CPW pilots around the state. They do a lot of big game stuff, but also do all of our aerial stalking. Wyoming does it with helicopters primarily. We use fixed wing aircraft and have 4 pilots, and they'll load, I mean, little canisters. They're about that big by about that tall. Oh gosh, that tall. And there's, I think, 6 of them in the airplane. And then they actually have little trap doors, and they've got numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and they can load X number of fish into a tube. I don't know how many that is per tube, but so if Kelly Lake and State Forest State Park is getting 600 cutthroat, that might be 2 tubes. So they're flying up that basin, literally dive bombing the lake under 200 feet below X miles per hour, hit cylinders 1 and 2, fish go out the door underneath the airplane. There's a pretty, if you just Google CPW aerial stalking, there's pretty cool video kind of outlining that process. Yeah, I guess it's hard to even pass any amount of that blame. I don't know that CPW is doing ourselves or you any favors with some of those descriptions. I can tell you we have 3-letter species codes that easily, I mean, not easily, but they identify a given strain, usually species, but strain of fish. So largemouth bass, LMB, brown trout, LOC, Loch Laven brown trout is why it's LOC. If it's just a rainbow trout, it's going to be RBT. But in the world of rainbow trout, I don't know how many strains we have, but probably 30. So TAS, Tasmanian rainbows, ELR, Eagle Lake rainbows, KM, KAM, Kamloops rainbows, RXN's a rainbow of one of those strains mixed with a cutthroat of some flavor. So in terms of that stocking report, it would be BAC would be the code that you'd be looking for. But I would say, that's not like the size of fish we stock in there. We're not making that available to the public in any type of platform. The majority of our stocking data is where did we put 10-inch rainbow trout is a lot of the information we give out. If you dive into specific fishery management survey summary reports which would be for a specific water body, most of those I would say should spell it out of like Colorado River cutthroat trout. Hopefully those don't say greenbacks, because I think that's just confusing, because unless it's dry Herman, that list of 9 locations or whatever it is, unless it's one of those, it's not a pure greenback. Sorry. You got any recommendations on how we could improve that? Gotcha. Yeah, so like our greenback code, which again, it's not a Bear Creek purple lineage, pure greenback, is GBN, and that is a product of rewind 30 years, what we thought were greenbacks. So we still have those genetics in hatcheries. We still have like a CRN, a CR1. Those are strains of Colorado River cutthroat trout. And those are a lot of times, not all the times, what are getting stocked in like alpine lakes. You might see a GBN, you might see where are you finding the 3-letter codes? Okay. Okay. Yeah, it would be there. Yeah, so it would be genetically whatever would have been stocked there after those reclamation conservation efforts through like the 90s primarily, which, you know, if you didn't ask me to, but I'm going to speak generally. I would guess a lot of those are going to be Colorado River genetics, maybe with a green lineage, some mixture. They might be, in some instances, we have pure blue lineage Colorado River cutthroat trout populations are just in the wrong spot. They're gorgeous fish. They've been there for 30 years, maybe 80 years. However, whether we reclaimed it or it was stocked in 1917, they've been there for a really long time. Those, unfortunately, are oftentimes, if they've been supporting fish since 1917, a pretty dang good candidate for greenback cutthroat trout because they've been supporting the slightly wrong strain of cutthroat trout for 100 years. So in some cases, we are removing Colorado River genetics out of a stream over here that's dry in Herman Gulch, and then putting Bear Creek greenbacks back in there. I will say before we do that, though, we do genetic testing on all of those populations. We've sampled most of these cutthroat trout streams. And so we are looking for like unique haplotypes. So if we find something in, let's just say, Dry Gulch had like a unique haplotype of Trappers Lake, Colorado River genetic cutthroat trout, we would certainly view that through a different lens of like, well, the fish that are in Dry Gulch are the exact same as these 71 other populations we have and the population at Rifle Fish Hatchery. Does that make sense? Good questions. Well, thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Kyle. Sounds like a big project and looks like you need a lot more staff. That's for sure.
Yeah, indeed. But yeah, I mean, we're making a lot of progress
Good.
for where we are, and a big project, but certainly an important one.
Very good.
My kids and great grandkids to be able to find a purple lineage greenback to fish for.
Very good. Well, thank you so much.
Yeah.